pile of 3D printed dwarf buildings. Join me in this video as I make a board, paint them up to make the ultimate dwarven city for tabletop wargaming. It's Jacob from Conquest Creations, and let's get straight into it. A few months ago, I launched my second Kickstarter, the Kingdom of Deep. For that project, I made this amazing dwarven table with the guys from Tabletop Time. Since then, the project launched, and because of the awesome community support, we got to release a whole bunch of stretch goals. So now I think it's time that I build my second board with all of these stretch goals to show them off. Let's get started with actually crafting this board. I started out by laying all of the pieces that I have printed out to see what the layout of this board could be. Pretty much at this point, I was just excited to see what it would look like when it was done and wanted to double check that I had enough buildings printed out. The goal is for this board to be great for competitive play of the Middle-earth strategy battle game and also have lots of replayability, which means it can be set up in different ways. With a couple layouts tested, let's get into the crafting. The first thing that I need to address is these boards. They aren't the prettiest, so let's give them a new look. I'm starting out by spraying these with a brown spray paint. It's out with that old drab grey colour and in with a new, more vibrant colour. With this spray, I didn't go for full coverage. I'm trying to leave some variety in the colour, and once they're sprayed, I brought them inside and I'm using this pot of brown paint that's just a sample pot from a hardware store that has served me well on many projects. It's always going to be helpful to have a good mid-tone in bulk in your arsenal, and it's going to be very, very helpful for terrain projects. I took my brown and I did a heavy dry brush with a nice and large brush. By making this brush extra dry and using a big brush, I avoided getting any brush marks in that dry brushing. Now, once I'd finished, it didn't really look like it was any different to at the start until I compared it to the other board that I had yet to dry brush, and I could see how big of a difference this makes. It's making the brown a lot more vibrant and a lot more actually brown instead of kind of just a dark grayish brown. So, now that I was feeling like I was actually doing something, I finished off the other board and then I went in with a much lighter brown that was almost just a cream, and I was very delicate with this and very selective just to increase the color variety. Because I was using paints from the hardware store, they have a slight glossy finish, so I decided to spray these with a matte varnish. By making them super matte, these are going to be great for doing battle reports on, and it means the bright studio lights won't cause any reflections that would detract from the models. I'm going to leave that to dry, and while it's drying, we're going to move on to our buildings. This pile of buildings was either printed on an Ender 3 or a Bamboo Lab P1P. Both of these printers are relatively affordable and are my two recommendations if you're interested in getting into 3D printing. The Bamboo Lab is a bit more expensive, but is very significantly better in every single way. But if you're looking for a cheap into the hobby, an Ender 3 is a great pickup. These were designed to be as easy to print as possible. That means that everything is in as few parts as possible and is entirely support-free. I wanted to show off the Dwarven brewery piece. This was one of the stretch goals from the Kickstarter. One of the backers suggested it because in all of the other buildings there wasn't a building that was associated with food and how the dwarves in our culture actually ate, so we thought that this would be a great way to do it. Zhao and I got to work on this. Zhao is a sculptor who joined the team initially as a freelancer to be the lead sculptor for the Kingdom of Deep, but because of how well the project went and how much support it got from the community, we've been able to offer him a full-time contract. So now, Zhao and I are working on putting together more and new exciting Conquest Creations projects. After a couple more successful projects, hopefully in the future we'll be able to add even more members to our team. Now, the painting on these buildings starts out pretty weird, but please stick with me. We're going to start with a heavy layer of brown across the floors and the bottom half of the buildings. All of these initial colors are going to be undertones. Now, it looks very strong how it is now, but it will become a lot more subtle. I focused the brown at the bottom of the buildings where dirt and grime would be accumulating. Now, after the brown, we repeat the same process with blue, but this time focusing on the top of the buildings. And after the blue, we're going to add in some random splotches of green. These can be at where you would imagine moss growing. At this point, the buildings look pretty terrible. You know what? In fact, they look absolutely terrible. Getting to this point is a little bit nerve-wracking because I'm definitely worried that they're going to stay looking this bad, but you just need to trust in the process and keep going. The next step is a dry brush of a mid-gray, and this is dry brushed across all of the surfaces, so on top of those greens, browns, and blues. Now, we want to be heavy with this dry brush, but not so heavy that we obscure all of those colors underneath. We want them subtly showing through so that we can get some more interest and more variety in our gray. After the first layer of gray, we're just going to add a bit more white into that gray mix to make it lighter, and then do a second dry brush. This time we want to be more selective, mainly focusing on the edges of the building so that we can add more dimensionality to the stonework. It's at this stage that you can really see those undertones shining and seeing how this could have just been a boring flat grey, but because we have those extra colours in there, it's a lot more interesting. At this stage, I got a bit excited and I brought this board inside to set it up and have its first game played on it. I felt like this was cheating a little bit because usually I would have waited until it was done, but I was really happy with how it was going and got a bit impatient. We had a game of the Middle-earth strategy battle game, and it was my Gondor army going up against Sauron the Necromancer and his ringwraiths. Don't ask me how these two armies managed to find themselves in a dwarven city, but, you know, it was a good game. This was actually a practice match for my upcoming Australian Masters army. With all the stonework covered, it looks like we're decently close to done with the painting, but the next step took significantly longer than all of the previous steps put together. I swapped out my large dry brush for a medium detail brush and started picking out all the gold detailing. We're starting with a bronze color for this. This is going to be a solid base coat for our gold. Now at this stage, you kind of have a bit of choice over what you want to be gold and what you want just to be decorative stonework. I leaned on more things being gold because I like the look, but the more gold you choose on these buildings, the more time this step's going to take. After covering up all of those small details, I got a slightly larger brush for the big flat gold sections on the roofs, and I just dry brushed those. This step by far took the most time, but it's also where the project comes into its own and it makes the biggest difference. The next step is highlighting all of that gold. I went from this dark bronze straight up to the brightest gold in my collection. Because this is terrain, we want high contrast that's going to stand out when we're looking at it from arm's length away. We could spend a lot more time blending our colors how we do on our miniatures, but if we wanted to do that across all of our terrain, each project would take absolutely forever and it wouldn't have as much contrast on the table. And finally, I went over all the roofs with another layer of dry brushing with this bright gold. Now across some of the buildings there were some extra details, like the bar and the brewery. That got a layer of dark brown and then a highlight with a lighter brown, again that high contrast, and then I picked out some of the silver pieces. The big piece of machinery on top of the brewery got some verdigris because I imagined that the liquid beer would be leaking out of these and slowly corroding the metal. The final touch for all of the buildings was painting the top of the walls in black. This is a super easy, quick, and super satisfying step that makes the whole entire project look clean and complete. Now the last step that we have to go is flocking those baseboards that I left to dry. I started by painting down a layer of glue and then sifting flock over the top. Now this flock was unfortunately super difficult to work with because it kept clumping up rather than sifting out and spreading evenly. Now I'm not sure if this is an intentional feature of the product, but it was not ideal for me. After each section was covered, I would tip off the excess flock, put it back in the container, and go again. Once it was all applied, I wanted to seal these boards tightly. I've made several boards in the past and find that flock like this constantly falls off and makes a mess, so I want to avoid that as much as possible. I mixed glue with water and sprayed it over the whole board. I let it dry in the sun and then did another layer. In total, I did 4 to 5 layers of this glue because I do not want this flock to move. And this is probably a little bit excessive, but I didn't want to take a risk. Joe and I designed each of these buildings to be as interesting and playable as possible. This building is the brewery, and we made sure that it had multiple doorways to allow models to move through the building in-game and make it harder to defend so that fighting can occur inside. We also included the balcony to allow archers to be within the building and shoot at their enemies below. But to keep that terrain piece balanced, we didn't give them any cover to hide behind. The bar was a fun inclusion for telling the story of the piece. This smaller building is the Lore Master's home. We have 3 doorways here so that if you place an objective inside, there are plenty of ways to move through it. Also, all of these doorways are perfectly sized for infantry models to squeeze through. We decided that in our lore for the dwarves, they like to keep records of their legends and mining exploits, so it would be really important to their culture, and we wanted to represent that in this building. The Tomb of Kings was another one of the stretch goals. This building has a big 40mm doorway that will allow monsters such as cave trolls inside. The mezzanine level should give archers a cool opportunity to shoot at their enemies that are fighting down below and give them a defensible position. Outside of these buildings, you can see piles of crates and barrels. These make the terrain feel real and actually lived in. They also provide extra barriers and fighting positions in-game. Alright, we've got the painting done, we've got the board done. Let's put everything together. I really like this city. It feels like we're in the middle of a city that expands outside the bounds of the board. There are a ton of different layouts that we'll be able to make with this terrain. That means it should always stay interesting and be replayable. If you want to get the STLs for any of these buildings and support the channel at the same time, you can visit our website, which is in the link in the description. Let me know in the comments what terrain you want to see us make next. And until the next time, thank you for watching.